Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This time, we're going way back to the 90s to New Jersey for a case that's really stayed with me, the Essex County prostitute killings. You sent this one in, and just reading through it, wow, what a story. Between 1993 and 1998, at least 14 women, and they were all involved in prostitution, were murdered, most of them in Newark. And the big question, the one that just hung over the whole thing was it a serial killer or were there multiple people doing this? And to make it even more, I don't know, unsettling is that no one was ever officially charged.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that leaves you with more questions than answers, really. And that's kind of what makes it so fascinating, even with the whole task force dedicated to it. Some things just remain a mystery.
Exactly. So, okay, let's try to, unpack what we do know. Like I said, most of the murders, 9 to be exact, happened in Newark, but there were others in some of the nearby towns like Irvington and East Orange. Doesn't that tell us something about the killer or killers?
It does. It often suggests some familiarity with the area. You're right, it's not random. They were comfortable there, maybe even saw it as their, well, hunting ground, so to speak. And then you've got the pattern with the victims themselves. All black women between 19 and 37 years old, and most, as you said, were working as prostitutes. So the perpetrator, whoever they were, had a very specific victim profile in mind.
It's really chilling when you think about it like that. And to add to it all, it's not like these killings all happened at once. We're talking 5 years, from 93 to 98.
That timeline is definitely one of the more perplexing aspects of the whole thing. Was the killer just lying low between murders? Were there specific things that triggered them that we don't know about? Or, like you said earlier, could it even have been different people, operating completely separately, which would make it even harder to connect everything?
And then there's the question of how these women were killed. It wasn't always the same. Some were strangled, some were stabbed, some were suffocated. Why change methods if it was one person?
Well, investigators, they use a term for that, modus operandi or MO. It's basically like the killer's signature style. And usually a consistent MO can help link different crimes, but when it's constantly changing, it really makes you wonder if this was one person. Were they experimenting, evolving their approach, or was it really multiple people, each with their own way of doing things?
Okay, so much to think about already. Let's go back to the beginning, like timeline-wise. Who was the first victim in all this?
Well, the first one who they think might be connected to this string of murders was a woman named Diane Floyd. She was 34 years old, and she was found murdered in her apartment on March 4th, 1993.
Wow. I can't imagine what that must have been like for the community, especially women who felt like they could be targets too.
Yeah, the impact on the community, especially the most vulnerable people, it can't be overstated.
And as the years went on, were there any other cases that really stood out, during the investigation? I'm thinking of Valerie Wilson. They found her body in a vacant lot in 1997. Her case, I think, became pretty important later on.
Oh, absolutely. Valerie Wilson's murder was a major turning point, yeah. It's one of the few where they actually made an arrest.
Right, but before we get to that, there were other victims too. Sharon Smith was found in a dumpster, same year, 97. And then Yolanda Earp, she was found dead just the next day. Was that like an escalation, do you think?
It's possible. I mean, having that many murders so close together might mean the killer was becoming more, I don't know, brazen, more confident, maybe even feeling a sense of urgency.
And the last known victim, Yvonne Lee, found in 1998. So tragic. So even with all this uncertainty, different MOs and the timeline, a lot of investigators seem to have really thought it was a serial killer. I even found this quote from the Star Ledger back in 98. It was a law enforcement source who said, all indication points to a serial killer.
That was the theory a lot of people had, yeah. And it's understandable. The victims, the locations, it all kind of pointed in that direction. But as we've said, the methods kept changing, and that made it really hard to actually definitively prove that it was one person.
It makes you wonder if maybe that idea that it was a serial killer right from the start, if that actually, I don't know, maybe hurt the investigation in some way. Could it have made them miss other possibilities, other suspects?
That's definitely a question worth thinking about. When investigators focus on one theory too early, it can create this, like, tunnel vision.
Yeah.
They might not see other things that could be important.
And we know they formed a whole task force in 1998 led by the Essex County prosecutor, Patricia Hurt. It seems like they were really, trying to step things up. What are some of the big challenges that task forces run into in these kinds of cases?
Well, just coordinating everything between different agencies, each with their own ways of doing things, their own priorities. That's tough. Then you have to deal with like jurisdictional stuff, especially when crimes happen in different cities or counties. And all of this is happening while the public and the media are watching, waiting for answers, wanting results. It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, no kidding. So did the task force ever find any, like, solid suspects?
They did focus on a couple. One was of Harit Malde. They arrested him in '98 for some, well, pretty awful things. He was impersonating a police officer, kidnapping and sexually assaulting prostitutes, 5 of them.
Wait, hold on. Posing as a cop to target women? That's a whole other level of messed up.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about him?
I mean, it definitely shows he was deliberate, calculated, that he knew how to exploit these women, how to use their trust in the police against them. Someone who's willing to impersonate an officer, they're probably pretty manipulative, pretty comfortable with using lies and deception to get what they want. It really raises a lot of questions about whether he could have been involved in the murders.
So were they ever able to connect him to any of the killings?
You know, they looked at him as a suspect really seriously, but they just never had enough evidence to charge him with any of the murders. And that's important to remember, even when you have someone who's done terrible things to similar victims, you still need rock-solid proof to connect them to specific murders. It's a really high bar.
So he wasn't convicted of the murders, but what about those other crimes? What happened to him in the end?
Ultimately, Malded was sentenced to 6 years in prison for those sexual assaults.
6 years. That seems really light considering what he did, and the possibility that he could have been involved in these murders.
I know, it does make you wonder, right?
Yeah.
But the sentencing can be complicated. There are a lot of factors that go into it. We don't know all the details of the case, so it's hard to say for sure why the judge decided on that sentence.
Okay, that's fair. So tell me about the other suspect they were looking at.
The other one was Harrison Hogue. He was arrested in '98 for the murder of Valerie Wilson. And what's interesting is that some of the local prostitutes, they had already suspected him even before he was arrested. They'd seen him around and just felt like something wasn't right. They actually told the police about their concerns, and that helped lead to his arrest.
Wow, that's a good reminder that sometimes the best information comes from the community,
Mm-hmm.
the people who are closest to what's going on. So was he ever charged with any of the other killings?
No, just Valerie Wilson's murder. But his case gets even more complicated because, at first, they said he wasn't competent to stand trial.
Incompetent. What does that actually mean?
It means that, at the time, they decided he couldn't understand the legal process or help his lawyer defend him. Could be because of a mental illness or some kind of cognitive problem. But, and there's always a but, with this case, later on they said he was competent to stand trial after all.
So they thought he could understand the charges and participate in his own defense.
Yeah, exactly. But then, even though they said he was competent, the prosecutors did something pretty surprising. They decided not to go ahead with the case.
Hold on. They had a suspect, they thought he was fit for trial, and they just, I don't know, gave up. Why?
That's the big question, and unfortunately the stuff you sent me doesn't really give us a clear answer.
Man, I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been for the families of the victims. To be so close to maybe getting some justice and then having it all just slip away.
I know, it's a terrible situation. And it really shows how complicated and, well, frustrating these kinds of investigations can be.
So even with all this, the task force, the arrests, all the leads, the Essex County prostitute killings are basically still unsolved.
That's right. They tried everything, but in the end, the investigators couldn't really bring any closure to this case. It's this really chilling reminder that some mysteries just never get solved, and sometimes justice is really hard to find.
It's just wild to me how a case that gets this much attention, all of this effort, can still end up, unsolved. Like, what else could they have done? Is there evidence out there that they missed, or?
It just shows you that even with the best intentions and all the resources in the world, sometimes justice, it just doesn't happen. These cases, they become like frozen in time, and all these questions, all these hopes for answers, they're left hanging.
And the families, the victims' families, they have to live with that not knowing, that open wound that never really heals.
Oh, absolutely. I can't even imagine their pain, their frustration. I mean, they've lost someone they love, and then on top of that, they don't get the closure that comes with knowing what really happened, seeing someone held accountable.
We've talked about the victims, the suspects, how hard the investigation was, but what about the community? What was it like in Essex County during those 5 years? I mean, knowing someone was out there targeting these women, it must have been terrifying.
Oh, yeah, the impact on a community. When you have these unsolved murders, it's huge. People start to worry about their own safety. Everything feels uncertain. It's like this, I don't know, this dark cloud just hanging over everything.
And for other women, I mean, women who were involved in sex work, it must have been just awful to know that someone was out there hurting women just like them.
They were living with this constant fear, this very real danger. A lot of them probably stopped going out on the streets, and that affects their livelihoods, you know. Could even push them into even riskier situations trying to make ends meet.
It's so sad. These women were already facing so many challenges, so much vulnerability, and then these murders, they just made everything so much worse.
Exactly. It really shows how some groups of people are marginalized,
Right.
made vulnerable by the system itself, you know.
So, okay, thinking back on all of this, the Essex County prostitute killings, what can we learn from it? What are the big things we should keep in mind, even all these years later?
Well, for one, it shows how important it is to understand the specific problems and vulnerabilities that marginalized communities face.
Mhm.
Women in sex work, they're often stigmatized, discriminated against, and they don't always have the same protections as other people. That makes them easier targets for violence and exploitation.
Yeah, we need to build a society that's more inclusive, more compassionate, one that doesn't just ignore the struggles of people who are already struggling, right? What else?
This case also shows how important it is to have, strong law enforcement and good investigative techniques. Investigating serial murders is really complex. You need special expertise, you need different agencies to work together, and you need a real commitment to doing a thorough job, even after the media attention dies down. We need to make sure that law enforcement has the resources, the training, everything they need to really do these investigations right.
I agree with you. It's not just about like having enough people on the case. It's about having the right skills, the right knowledge, the right approach. Is there anything else?
Oh, there's one more big thing. This case shows how important it is for the community to be involved and for there to be trust between the police and the community. If people don't trust the police, they're less likely to talk to them, even if they've seen something really important. Building those relationships, that's crucial for solving crimes, for making things safer for everyone.
It's about working together, like a partnership towards the same goal. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into this, I don't know, this really haunting case, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that these women, even though they were involved in something that a lot of people see as, tabooed or whatever, they were still human beings. They had lives, they had families, they had stories, and they deserved justice, and their stories deserve to be told. The Essex County prostitute killings are still unsolved, but we shouldn't forget them. They show us how complicated the criminal justice system is, how important it is to protect vulnerable communities, and how powerful a mystery can be, even after all these years.
That was really well said. And even though the official investigation might be over, the search for the truth, for understanding, that should never really end. And that's where you come in, dear listener.
That's right. We've given you the facts, the complexities, the dead ends, all the questions that are still out there. But it's like this puzzle with missing pieces. And what we haven't really talked about is, speculation. Taking what we do know and going a little further with it.
So like we're all putting on our detective hats now.
Yeah, exactly. We want our listeners to think critically. Remember those unanswered questions we talked about? Could there have been some other connection between the victims besides their work? Were there things that people could have done to intervene, warning signs they missed? And what about those suspects? Were there other people who were never really investigated?
This is where it gets really interesting for me. We're going from like looking back at history to what if. What if some of the things the investigators thought were true just weren't? What if there's a whole other side to this story that we're missing?
I know, right?
Yeah.
Like, what if those changes in the MO, the way the victims were killed, what if that was on purpose? To make it seem like it was more than one person when it was really just one killer? Or maybe there was someone else involved, an accomplice, helping to get rid of bodies, doing other things, making it even harder to find the killer.
Okay, now my mind is going a mile a minute.
Yeah.
These are some pretty dark possibilities, but it really makes you realize how much we don't know.
Exactly. We're not saying we know the answers, but we want our listeners to think for themselves, look at the evidence in a new way, and really explore those what-if scenarios.
So it's like we're passing the torch, right? Letting our listeners be part of the investigation even all these years later.
That's the great thing about Unsolved Mysteries. They pull you in, they make you want to be involved, to use your own imagination and try to figure things out, and that keeps the mystery alive.
I love that idea, yeah. It's like we're turning all our listeners into detectives, giving them the case file and say, okay, go for it.
That's right. And you never know. Maybe someone out there will see something that everyone else has missed. Some little detail, some connection, some new way of looking at the evidence, and maybe, just maybe, that could help shed some light on this whole, dark chapter in Essex County's history.
So to everyone listening, if you're like hooked on this case like we are, don't stop here. Go back to those sources we talked about, do some more digging, and see what you find.
You might be surprised, yeah. Sometimes all it takes is a fresh pair of eyes to really make a difference with a cold case like this.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into the Essex County prostitute killings, a case that, sadly, is still unsolved. We've gone over the evidence, the suspects, the dead ends, all those unanswered questions that still linger after all this time.
Yeah, it's a case that really reminds us how complicated criminal investigations can be, how some mysteries just stay with us, and how important it is to keep fighting for justice for those who can't speak for themselves anymore.
And maybe even more importantly, we've invited you, our listeners, to join us in that search for the truth. So keep those detective hats on, stay curious, and never stop asking questions. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to finally crack this case wide open.
Until next time, everyone, keep exploring those unsolved mysteries, and always remember, the truth is out there somewhere, just waiting to be found.